Over the last lectures, we had a super detailed look at all the theory behind React, what it's doing behind the scenes, how it is creating component, the life cycle, and that's important, of course, how we may use this theoretical background, this concept behind React to optimize React apps. It is something you will also see in the course projects we're going to build. That, of course, makes it then even easier to understand, to see when to use a lifecycle, how to reach out to the web from component did mount, and where to use a pure component, for example. Still, this should be a first idea. And there are more things you will see throughout the course projects, which I want to introduce right now. And one thing is something I did mention earlier. You learned that our components typically have a wrapping element, that you must not have multiple elements sit next to each other on a root level inside your render method, or to be precise, inside the return statement of your render method. This is a restriction of React. It's kind of loosened with React 16 though. For example, in persons.js, we have no issue returning person this array. We just return an array here, keep this in mind. We're mapping this JavaScript array into an array of JSX elements. And that's an important takeaway. You may return an array of elements. This is something which is okay. Not elements sitting next to each other, but if it's an array of JSX elements, like it is here, it works. And of course you can do this here too in person.js. You could return an array of these three elements. Each array item then also needs to have a key though, as it's the case here for our persons array. So no matter if you automatically generate the array with the map method, or if you do it manually, like so, you could of course have an array with the first paragraph, then a second element, and the third element here. This would be a valid array, though you need to key it. So let me comment out the first return statement for now, and let me save this updated code. If we now go back to our application, open the console, if we reload it and toggle persons, you see we actually get an error in between that each child in an array should have a key. You also see that the styles are missing. That simply happens because we no longer have this wrapping element which had the person class, which in this case was needed because here the wrapping div is not just a must, but something we also need for styling. So in this case, returning array isn't even optimal, but you can do it. And if you add a key with a unique ID, of course you can hard code it if it's not dynamically generated, as it's the case here. So if you do that, if you now save this and reload your application, toggle persons, no error to be seen. Still, in this example here, not the most useful thing because we actually need the wrapping div, but I wanted to highlight that you can return arrays. Now I'll go back to my old code here still, and you will most of the time have code like this and not return arrays. The exception is components which handle the rendering of lists like our persons component does. There it's very convenient that we don't have to wrap this changed array, this updated, this transformed array in a div. Now there's another exception. Let's consider the cockpit.js file. There we also have a wrapping div to apply the cockpit class. If we check out the CSS file though, we don't really need the cockpit class except for the button and so on, which we want to scope for this component. Well, we could simply create our own button class for this though. We could define a button class here for hover, combined with the red class, and also for red and hover. Now there's no cockpit class in there. And all we have to do in our code now is assign this button class, so that for our button, we either have classes button as a default. Keep in mind, CSS modules now give us this button class because we defined it here in the CSS file. And for the case that we want to add the red class, we would simply have an array of classes. So classes red, but prior to that, also classes button. And then in the end, we just join it with a white space. Now with that, if we save this code and go back to the application, the button looks and works as before, but now this wrapping div is redundant. We can remove the class name there and still have the same button style. So it's redundant, and it would be nice if you could get rid of it. Now one solution is to remove it and return an array of elements here, but there also is another alternative. We can create a higher order component for that. So I'll go into source and I'll create a new folder which I'll name HOC for higher order components. Higher order components are absolutely normal React components. They have one specialty though. They are not representational, but they wrap other components to add a certain functionality. For example, we can create an aux component for auxiliary. And this component will have one single task. It will be a function, aux, which gets props and which returns some JSX. It obviously needs to import React because again, it's just a normal component. In there though, all I want to do is I want to output props children wrapped in curly braces. Or we don't even need to do that. We can just return props children like that. And now export a default, the aux function. This component might look useless because all it does is returning what's passed between the opening and closing tag. This, however, is huge because we can now use this aux component in the cockpit component here. There, we can import aux with a capital A from 2 levels up, HOC, aux.js, without the file extension as always. And now we can wrap our code here with our custom aux component, the one we just created. Now we no longer get an error here because we have a wrapping component, but we don't actually create a wrapping HTML element because aux is empty. We may just return props children. That is the key takeaway. We don't have to wrap this. And even if props children are then adjacent HTML elements, as it's the case here, these are the children, it will still work in React 16. That's pretty cool because sometimes you don't want to introduce a separate HTML element, like a wrapping div, if you don't need it for styling reasons. It can even destroy your styling if you're using Flexbox or something like that. So with that, if we save this, we get a working application. No errors to be seen, except for React is defined but never used in aux. That is because we don't even have React create element, so we can remove it there even, make this even leaner, because all we do is distribute props children. So now we have a very lean setup, but we save this extra redundant HTML element here in the cockpit, this div which we don't really need. This is something I wanted to bring to your attention, that you can return arrays like in persons, and that you can return props children like in aux. And even though these might be adjacent, React is fine with that, React 16 at least. Something you have to keep in mind, and something which allows you to save that unnecessary div element we had to use prior to this solution here.